You think you became who you are through your experiences, your discipline, your decisions as an adult navigating an adult life. You didn't, or at least not mostly. The person you are right now, the way you attach to people, the way you respond to stress, the stories you tell yourself about your own worth, the emotional patterns that derail you even when you know they're happening, most of that was already in place before you turned 7, before you could read, before you had the cognitive equipment to question any of it, before you had any say in the matter at all. And it is definitely not a reason to blame your parents for everything, though it will probably make you think about them differently. What happened to you before age 7 is still running your life right now. And once you understand exactly how and why, you will never see yourself the same way again. Start with what neuroscientists have established about the developing brain. The human brain is not born complete. It is born radically unfinished. In the first 3 years alone, the brain forms approximately 1 million new synaptic connections every second. The architecture being built during this window is not temporary scaffolding. It is the foundation, and foundations determine what can be built on top of them. Developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, whose work in the mid-20th century laid the groundwork for our understanding of how children think, established that the first 7 years of life constitute what he called the pre-operational stage, a period in which the child's brain absorbs experience without the cognitive capacity to analyze, contextualize, or question it. A child before age 7 cannot think critically about what is happening to them. They cannot say the situation is stressful because of circumstances outside my control and therefore I don't need to internalize it as evidence of my own inadequacy. They simply absorb. The experience becomes the belief. The event becomes the template. The repeated pattern becomes the assumption about how the world works. Psychiatrist and researcher Daniel Siegel at UCLA, whose work on interpersonal neurobiology has transformed how clinicians understand early development, describes this encoding in terms of what he calls implicit memory. It is the memory of how things felt, how the body responded, what the nervous system learned to expect, and implicit memory is operational from birth. Explicit memory, the kind you can consciously recall, develops later, which means that experiences your conscious mind has no access to, experiences you genuinely cannot remember, are nevertheless encoded in your nervous system as assumptions, as defaults, as the automatic responses that fire before conscious thought arrives. This is why you can know, intellectually, that you are safe in a relationship and still feel anxious. Why you can understand, rationally, that you are capable and still hear an internal voice that contradicts that understanding. The knowledge lives in explicit memory. The pattern lives in implicit memory. Psychologist John Bowlby spent decades developing what became known as attachment theory. His central finding was simple and profound. The way a child's primary caregiver responds to their needs in the first years of life creates an internal working model, a template for how relationships work, what to expect from other people, and what the self is worth in relation to others. This template is not a conscious belief. It is a structural feature of how the brain processes social information. Bowlby's colleague Mary Ainsworth extended this work with what became known as the strange situation experiment. She observed how toddlers between 12 and 18 months responded when briefly separated from their caregiver and then reunited. What she found was that children fell into distinct patterns of response: secure, anxious, ambivalent, anxious, avoidant, and later disorganized, that corresponded directly to the quality and consistency of caregiving they had received. And critically, decades of longitudinal research following these children into adulthood found that the attachment pattern established in those early years predicted with striking consistency how those same individuals would behave in adult romantic relationships, how they would handle conflict, how they would respond to intimacy, how they would manage fear of abandonment. The pattern set before age 2 was still operational at age 40. You cannot think your way out of an attachment pattern with your prefrontal cortex when the pattern lives in your brainstem. The change has to happen at the level where the pattern was formed, at the level of felt experience, of embodied safety, of repeated relational contact that gradually teaches the nervous system something different from what it learned in the first years of life. Neuroscientist and trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk has written about what he calls the body keeps the score. The experiences encoded in the nervous system in early childhood are not stored as memories you can retrieve and examine. They are stored as body states, as patterns of tension and relaxation, as thresholds of arousal and shutdown, as the automatic physical responses that appear before conscious thought has a chance to intervene. The body is carrying information the mind does not have access to, and until that information is addressed at the level of the body, through therapeutic approaches that work directly with the nervous system rather than only with cognition, the pattern persists regardless of how much intellectual understanding the adult has accumulated. What does this mean for the adult sitting with this information right now? It means that the emotional patterns you are most frustrated by, the anxiety that appears without obvious cause, the relationship patterns that repeat despite your best intentions, the inner critic that narrows your sense of what you are capable of, the difficulty trusting people who have given you no reason not to trust them. These are not character flaws. They are not evidence of weakness. They are the logical outputs of a system that was calibrated under conditions you did not choose, in a window of development you do not remember, by caregivers who were themselves carrying the outputs of their own early experiences. Understanding this changes the question. The question is no longer what is wrong with me. The question is what happened to me. And that is a question that leads somewhere, because what happened can be understood. What was learned can, with time and the right conditions, be unlearned. The nervous system that learned vigilance can learn safety. The attachment system that learned to expect abandonment can, in relationships of sufficient consistency and warmth, gradually update its model. The body that learned to brace can, with sustained practice, learn to release. The research on neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong capacity to form new connections, offers genuine reason for measured optimism here. The brain that was shaped by early experience can be reshaped by later experience. Not quickly, not easily, not by simply deciding to be different, but through the accumulation of new experience that contradicts the old template. Through therapeutic relationships that provide the consistent, attuned contact the nervous system needed and didn't receive. Through somatic practices that work directly with the body's stored responses. Through any sustained engagement with an environment or relationship that teaches the nervous system, slowly and repeatedly, that the old rules no longer apply. The first 7 years did not write a sentence you cannot revise. They wrote a first draft in the most permanent ink available to a developing brain. In language you were too young to read, about a world you were too small to see clearly. And the work of adulthood, the real work underneath the career and the relationships and the identities you have constructed since, is learning to read that draft, to understand what it says, and to decide, with the agency you now possess and did not then, which parts of it you are willing to keep. You became who you are before you had any say in the matter. That is the difficult truth this research delivers. But you are not finished becoming. That is the other truth, the one that makes the first one survivable.